Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents NFL Brawler, a player-turned-agent's 40 years in the bloody trenches of the National Football League, by Ralph Cindrich, narrated by R.C. Bray. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt. Introduction. The pitch. It's almost time. Someday soon, I'll make a couple of calls and schedule a meeting with some Hollywood big shot. I'll sit across an expensive desk in the shadow of a massive ego and some shelves lined with shiny awards, and for once, make a pitch for myself. I'll stare the guy straight in the eye, just as I always did with those NFL owners, and sell him on the best story he could ever tell. My own. What kind of plot lines do you like? I'll ask. Conflict? I almost punched a Super Bowl champion coach only to have the fight broken up by Cowboys owner Jerry Jones. I got into a drinking contest with Colts owner Bob Irsay, a guy so universally hated that his own mother called him the devil. I spurned Penn State legend Joe Paterno after he traveled through bitter weather to recruit me, spawning a feud that would linger for a few years afterward. That's not enough? You want something rags to riches? Go back to where I was born. I grew up in Avella, Pennsylvania, a rough-and-tumble coal mining town that went bust long before I arrived, a place one considered to be one of the poorest in the country. But my upbringing gave me enough grit to advance far beyond it. I was an All-American in college, a professional football player for 4 years, and before long, a big-time agent in a billion-dollar business, securing million-dollar deals almost every time I signed my name. Or maybe you want something softer, like a love story. My eyes found Mary Rose across the room at a frat party in college, and I fell in love right then. We've been together ever since, married for 4 decades, with 2 kids and an everlasting love, one of those make-believe romances that only happens in fairy tales. How about something with a harder edge? Sex, drugs, rock and roll. My Houston Oilers team covered most of those themselves. We had a first-round defensive end who seemed to be pumped full of everything, and other players who found an avalanche of cocaine every time they went out on the town. And then there's the agent business, too, an industry that was overtaken by the mob for about half a decade, a profession often infested by unethical people who recruit players with cash, cars, and women in varying degrees of clothes. Maybe that's not it. Maybe you need something more wholesome. The vast majority of my clients were the professional football players you never hear enough about, guys who were involved with their families and active in their communities, a bunch of people who put their teammates and others far ahead of themselves, guys like Mark May, Al Toon, Paul Gruber, and a whole bunch more. I represented Kent Hull, who stood up for a teammate in his darkest moment after a Super Bowl-winning kick went wide right. And on top of that, I was pretty damn ethical, too, an outlier in my slimy business, someone who still believed in rules, morals, and the promise of a spoken word. You want some memorable characters, too? My youth football coach was a standout athlete who lost a leg in World War II, but never entertained excuses for himself or any of the numerous players he coached. I worked with Herschel Walker, one of the biggest names in football, a downtrodden youth who became a college legend and eventually became involved in the biggest trade in NFL history. And I knew the chief, Art Rooney, a benevolent guy who loved cigars and horse races but never missed a single day of Catholic Mass. He founded the Pittsburgh Steelers as a young man and built the team into a powerhouse that made him the most beloved person in town. And if that's not enough, every buzzword that you've ever heard attached to football appears in my story too. Painkillers, concussions, violence. I've seen it, endured it, and advised my clients on how to handle it themselves. My story has it all. People are going to love it, and it could make you a lot of money. But if you're not interested, I'll walk out of this office right now and find someone else who is. You want to hear more? Put your feet up. Get comfortable. Pour yourself a drink. I'll tell you the whole damn thing. We'll see what an impact Ralph Cindrich has on this draft right away. It's 1985. The NFL draft is live on ESPN, and a 24-year-old kid named Mel Kiper Jr. is firing off phrases like machine gun rounds, shooting names and information to a nationwide audience that's becoming more invested every year. Soon, Kiper and all the other analysts are speeding into a conversation about the draft's biggest storylines, and I'm near the top of the list. I'm only a few years into my career as an agent, and not far removed from a contract war with the Washington Redskins over my client Mark May. It was time to enter the arena again. With a lot of work and a little luck, I landed two of the draft's biggest names, Bill Fralick and Al Toon, two high-profile players who deserved to be top 10 picks. Fralick was the son of a steel mill worker and a monster offensive tackle from the University of Pittsburgh who received 81 Heisman Trophy votes in his senior season. Toon was a wideout from the University of Wisconsin who rewrote the school's receiving records in football and was also a two-time All-American in the triple jump. The draft would decide their fates in a matter of minutes, and I was trying to hijack the whole thing. Fralick wanted to play somewhere warm, which sure as hell wasn't in Minnesota, which owned the number 2 pick, and both Toon and I believed Indianapolis could derail his career. The Colts were only a year away from their midnight escape from Baltimore and had gone 4-12 in 1984, so I was doing my best to scare off both teams, having sent cautionary letters to each franchise, but I still hoped to get my clients drafted early in the first round by someone else, with all the prestige and contract dollars that the players deserved. We'll see if those teams shy away from Fralick and Toon, Kiper continued, his trademark black hair slicked back and stationary. We will see if Cindrich has a direct impact on the draft. Every career, perhaps every life, has a few tipping points. Mine had arrived. With a great draft and a couple of quality contracts, I'd be on my way as an agent, a proven commodity in a burgeoning business. But if the draft or my ensuing negotiations went bust, my career might too. With the cameras rolling and televisions tuned in at home, my success or failure was about to be broadcast live. What would happen next? No one knew, and I had plenty of reason to worry. I told Fralick to go golfing that day and skip out on the entire thing. Mike Lynn, the general manager of the Vikings, had made his money with movie theaters. He was notoriously cheap and seemed to enjoy screwing players over, often squeezing them for every last dollar he could get. I thought for sure he'd take Fralick. Time passed, the tension grew. With the first pick, the Buffalo Bills took Bruce Smith, an explosive defensive end from Virginia Tech. Then the Vikings exhausted the entire draft clock at number 2. Time was up. What happened next would determine the course of my career. Commissioner Pete Rozelle stood in front of the podium ready to deliver the verdict. With the second pick in the 1985 draft, one way or another, my next battle was about to begin, and I wasn't about to back down. My entire life up to that point had been filled with conflict, tackles and takedowns, arguments and adversaries. I'd been fighting the odds and everything else since the day I was born. Avella. The Homestead. My hometown's roughneck spirit started forming before our country was born. The first settlers in Avella were colonists on the edge of the frontier, people pushing the limits of established boundaries and encroaching on Indian lands. According to local historian Mark Mamros, the western edge of Pennsylvania hadn't been drawn in the 1760s, so settlers bold enough to build homes there did so without any formal protection. No soldiers, no militias, nothing. The families settling western Pennsylvania back then were on their own. They clustered together and built forts, about 30 to 40 of them in the area overall, to protect themselves from Indian attacks. Wars ensued, boundaries were drawn, and eventually some of those clustered forts became Avella, Pennsylvania, the town where I grew up. The railroad arrived in the early 1900s, and an abundance of opportunity rode in on its rails. Large beds of coal and wide swaths of profits were waiting underground. Companies began building one mine after another, confident that railroad cars could carry out their hauls. At the beginning, there was a lot more coal than miners, leaving an excess of work and wages. Immigrants from Europe, my grandparents included, arrived on a seemingly endless stream of boats and chased that opportunity all the way into western Pennsylvania, crawling after the American dream in those underground mines. The population of Avella started swelling, taking on more immigrants, more homes, and more life early in the 20th century. The entire town was transformed. Something happens to a place when a large part of the populace starts each day by descending underground and moves forward in incremental inches, collecting more calluses and more dirt every minute. Throw in the obvious dangers of such strenuous work, cave-ins, clogged lungs, and errant explosions, to name just a few, and it's not long before the toughness becomes way too big to remain trapped underground. It escapes into the outside air and slams against the sweat on a farmer's brow or the boots of a steel worker that were almost melted by the mill. Toughness gathered everywhere in Avella and multiplied among its peoples. Hands were heavy, hearts were hard, backbones were thick. The meek might inherit the earth, but they sure as hell weren't easy to find in Avella. In 1922, about 400 miners from the area stormed a non-union mine in nearby Brooke County, West Virginia, hoping to close down the entire operation. A battle ensued, and before it ended, the sheriff of Brooke County was dead, 8 miners were imprisoned, and many more were killed, buried in crude, unmarked graves in the woods between both mines. Another oft-told true story involved the Ku Klux Klan and a couple of burning crosses. Klan members in Avella hated the immigrants, and were often angry that the newcomers took the jobs, and occasionally their women, too. A Klan member burnt a cross on the hill above our town in protest. The next day, a Klansman was dead. A little later, a second cross was set ablaze, and a second Klansman was dead. The message got through. The Klan and their burning crosses were never seen in Avella again. That story survived for years, though. A legend for kids both in town and beyond about what it meant to be from Avella. That renegade spirit, resolve, and toughness got embedded in the kids of my hometown and soon turned the blue and gold Avella Eagles into an athletic powerhouse. It actually started in soccer when little old Avella won 2 straight youth soccer national championships in 1939 and 1940. A little bit later, high school coach Ray Fiorini and all the Pee-wee coaches underneath him brought life to the football teams in town. I always called him Coach, even though he was never really my coach. Fiorini served in World War II, then settled in Avella, inheriting a football program that was often a punching bag for bigger teams. But Fiorini saw past the mere numbers to the assets lying underneath. Those kids of coal miners and laborers and farmers had hard edges that others didn't, and a hunger too. They thought nothing of sweating through 3 practices in a single day, with the only breaks arriving when the kids stripped off their clothes and splashed down in a nearby creek. Since the amenities afforded to other kids were often missing, it seemed an abundance of camaraderie helped close the gaps. It's a funny thing. It was kind of a classless society, my brother Bob said. Everyone was poor. There was no wealthy section. We were all working people. You didn't notice the fact that you were poor because everyone else was too. We were all in the same boat and all had a desire to get out of it. Fiorini turned all that togetherness, toughness, and determination into a football dynasty, a local source of pride that had 4 undefeated seasons, 4 league titles, and 2 Western Pennsylvania championships in a 10-year stretch. A proud town puffed its chest out even more, and every kid who wore blue and gold played with a chip on his shoulder pads, propped up by a proud tradition and bleachers full of screaming fans. My parents, A.J. and Stella Cindrich, arrived in Avella right in the middle of the athletic glory, their old-fashioned values and hard-nosed sons sustaining the status quo in town and the success on the playing fields, too. My dad was the son of a Croatian butcher whose parents crossed the Atlantic and settled in Slovan, Pennsylvania, just down the road from Avella. Many Croatian immigrants enjoyed the hills of western Pennsylvania because the rolling landscapes reminded them of home. But the life they encountered there was hard on almost everything outside the eyes. A.J. Cindrich was built like a beer barrel with big, meaty hands weathered by a whole bunch of blue-collar work. He grew up in the shadows of a steel mill and worked a few shifts there in his younger years. But then World War II broke out and he became a paratrooper, returning home even harsher than when he left. He started an excavation business and then a utility pipeline company, making his living with a lot of hard labor. He nearly lost a few fingers once when a machine he was working on smashed them, leaving them bloody, mangled, and hanging by a thread. He missed a few months of work, but his fingers unfortunately held on, making all the backhands I got later in life a few digits worse. My mother, Stella Safara, was born on a boat coming to the United States from Calabria, Italy. She was the youngest of 3 sisters and a very bright girl, smart enough to skip a grade in school. Stella's parents ran a bar in the heart of Avella, a place that had a huge dance hall and a number of hotel rooms, too. For a time, it was one of the most popular hangouts in Washington County, with plenty of room for young people to knock back a few beers and dance to some jukebox songs with anyone who might catch their more forgiving eyes. A.J. was a somewhat legendary drinker who would occasionally visit Safara's to socialize with friends and quench his persistent thirst. One day he met my mother there, and the two probably shared a few looks, then a dance, a drink, a moment, and then everything else that sends you quickly off into love. Stella's kind heart softened the edges of A.J.'s exterior just long enough for romance to take root. The two were married a little bit later. They eventually settled into a white one-story house on a bend in the road just outside town, only a few miles away from the bar where they first met. The children of immigrants would live there for years, filling the next several decades with a lot of labor, love, and Avella's version of the American dream. Before long, they'd give birth to 5 kids, and one of them would test every single limit they had. Young Ralph. The Restless Spirit. A.J. and Stella were in trouble. I was born on October 29th, 1949. Exactly 20 years after the stock market crashed in New York and Lincoln National Bank in Avella went broke. Soon after I entered the world, I started testing the limits of it. He was the cutest kid you ever saw, my brother Bob, who was 5 years older, remembers. But he was mischievous, always into something. Damn ornery, my brother Ron says. One of my earliest memories is of climbing a fence around our house when I was about 4 years old. We lived in a ranch-style home on an old country road, and I started wandering down it soon after I learned to walk. My parents built a fence about 5 feet high to pen me in. It didn't work. I can still remember putting my feet on the fence to climb over it. But I lost my balance in the process, flipped over the top, and landed hard on some gravel, just inches away from the fence itself, with a gaping head wound. It was perhaps my first concussion. Football would give me many more. My mother was mortified. She couldn't figure out how I escaped, but knew that I'd try again sometime soon. The gate stayed open until they took the fence down. I was one of 5 kids in our family's 4-room house. Ron, Robert, Rita, myself, and Rebecca. As a kid, I got the nicknames Nunic from an old comic and Big Bruiser from an Easter bunny I drew in elementary school. With all of us living in such close quarters, there was a lot of fun to be had, and perhaps a few fights, too. But I'm sure my brothers and sisters enjoyed having me around, because I seemed to keep a lot of my dad's legendary heat off of everyone else. Avella was the perfect place for a restless spirit like me. There were rolling hills and woods in almost every direction that I might run. I fell in love with the open spaces around me, and my interest in wildlife began back then, too. One time I caught a black snake and carved it up like it was a Thanksgiving turkey, showing it off to a prissy little girl I hoped to impress. Her mother wasn't amused. My dad wasn't either. But my adventures continued. Times were different back then, when kids were untethered by tablets and television screens. If we didn't have school, we'd spill out of the house early in the morning and only return for lunch, dinner, and bedtime. One time I made a homemade bow and arrow and shot it at a car coming down the road. Bullseye. The poor guy almost wrecked. I sprinted into our backyard and over the hill past my brother Ron, who had no idea what the hell had just happened. Ron said it was the fastest 40-yard dash of my life. In a few seconds I was out of sight and into my hideout, a hillside cave that was really an old coal mine entrance without my imagination. I often fled there when I found trouble, and needless to say I had a blanket and food inside and made sure it was always stocked. I was waiting out the trouble when the car I hit pulled in our driveway. A stranger got out. Ron swears he was 6 feet 6 inches. "Did you see a young boy running around here?" the guy asked. Ron thought the guy had a drawl, like he was from somewhere out west where vigilante justice works just fine. I said, "No, sir, I didn't see anyone," Ron remembers. I said, "Why? What happened?" "Someone shot an arrow at my car as I was coming around the curve." The guy eventually left before he could locate my hideout or find me sweating inside it. Perhaps I was predisposed to trouble, but my dad made sure I got punished for every mistake. Discipline waited for me at the end of every line I crossed. In 1955, I was about 6 years old, and I went inside a gas station that sold candy, too. Impulse overtook me, and I shoplifted some penny candy. My sister promised not to tell, but ratted me out as soon as we got home. My dad asked me if it was true. I said no. Wrong answer. A.J. Cindrich was a man of ethics and integrity, and his word was better than a contract. Seeing his son as a thief and a liar made him lose every last bit of his mind. He took a belt and beat me senseless. When he was finished, he grabbed the scruff of my neck and the seat of my pants and tossed me out into the front yard. He gave me a razor blade and told me to cut the grass. Every single blade of grass. 2 hours passed. Darkness rolled in. "Enough!" my mother yelled. Stella Cindrich was a woman of ethics and integrity, too, but she was also a lioness when it came to protecting her young. If she ever felt her family was threatened, she'd grab a butcher knife with every intent to use it. On this particular day, she thought the punishment was starting to exceed the crime. After seeing the extent of my beating and blade cutting, she was pretty sure the lesson had sunk in. It did. If I've ever taken anything again in my life that is not mine, my mind blocks it out. You would be hard-pressed to find anyone who ever said as a man I ever lied, cheated, or stole. Some lessons you never forget. The beauty of my upbringing was that I had a lot of other adults who influenced me in addition to my parents. My mother made massive spaghetti dinners, a tradition I've continued ever since. The smell of garlic and sauce would slip out of our house and down the driveway, luring 20, 30 or more family members or friends to pop in for a meal. My mother and father eventually started a pipeline company, putting in gas and other utility lines. They were trying to make a better life for all of us and had to work pretty hard to do it. They woke up early and drove roughly 30 miles to work every day except for Sunday. My mom wasn't around much, so she convinced Aunt Rose to come stay with us and look after me. Zia Rosa was born in Italy and remembered the town square and the dances there as long as she lived. Over here, she ran a country store in Rochester, Pennsylvania, a rough-and-tumble town a lot like Avella. Zia Rosa was a kind lady with a very gentle heart. I consider her my angel and still send her occasional prayers and thanks all of these years later. The few soft spots I have somewhere inside me are partly due to her. But with my penchant for mischief and my father's devotion to punishing it, the good feelings never seemed to last too long in my house. How I lived into adulthood still baffles me some days. Besides my mother, sports probably deserves the silver medal for saving my ass. My older brothers were great athletes in their own right, and I often tagged along to their practices and games, accelerating my own athletic development in the process. Plus, I eventually grew to a good size, which certainly didn't hurt in sports either. As I began to excel on the playing field, whether in football, wrestling, or baseball, AJ couldn't help but swell with pride. And for a few hours, he forgot about kicking my ass, but that doesn't mean he got soft. In one game when I was about 9 years old, my fingers got stomped on by an opponent with sharpened spikes. Blood was pouring out. Both the ligaments and the bone were visible, and the scar persists to this day. I went to the sideline, and my father stopped over to provide his medical opinion. Piss on it and get back out there. I can't remember if my bladder was full enough to consider his treatment, but I was wise enough to know that urine didn't make a great antiseptic. And I didn't have time to waste searching for my dinkle either. In any case, I got back on the field. And so it went for the remainder of my childhood. My mom instilled the importance of family and provided all the compassion she could. My dad gave me the toughest of loves and enough backhands to keep me in line. Between the two, I got a full complement of old-fashioned values with unlimited lessons on how to act, work, and make something out of myself. Those teachings stayed with me long after I left home, and they carried me to my dreams. Mario Gabrielli, The Hero. It's June 10th, 1944. The world is at war. The Nazis are in Europe, and the largest, costliest invasion in modern history is finally complete on the coast of France. Paratroopers who never had a prayer are still hanging in the trees. My future Pee-wee coach, Mario Gabrielli, had just arrived to hell on earth. What would happen next would forever change Mario's life, and mine, and perhaps 100 or so others across the ocean in a villa. But no one could have known it then. If it wasn't for his sister Fran Monroe in San Diego who took down his story, the memory of his life would be as silent as the hundreds laid out at Normandy. Mario, or Gary as we called him when he was our coach, was only 18 then. He was a tough and toned athlete just a few months removed from the campus at Waynesburg College and his pro football dreams. War interrupted everything. Gabrielli left college and his previous life and joined the Army in February of 1943. Before long, he was crammed into cattle cars in Africa, carrying bazookas into battle and scrambling to avoid German artillery in Sicily. On that Italian isle, amid the death and destruction raining from the Mediterranean skies, the fear Mario had been sidestepping since he enlisted finally gained equal footing. Its icy clutches grabbed hold, and it would be months, maybe years, before it ever let go. I remember hearing shelling in the distance, the cold fear in the pit of my stomach. I didn't allow myself to think, to feel anymore. I cared for nothing, except the 9th Infantry Division 60th Regiment Headquarters Company. It rolls off my lips with pride. The German assault continued. Each explosion shattered Mario's memories of a villa and football and childhood games. But a chance encounter brought a few of them back together. Somewhere in Sicily, Gabrielli found Bill James, a football rival at Trinity High. A few years back, before the war ruined everything, Gabrielli's Class B Avella team beat a much bigger Trinity team 5-0. Mario had scored every point, kicking a 53-yard field goal and tackling an opponent in the end zone for a safety. That was the greatest moment of my life. It was perhaps the closest he'd ever get to a shining moment. Teammates carried him off the field on their shoulders. Waynesburg offered him a scholarship that night. But now in Europe, it was almost impossible to think about anything that had happened across the Atlantic. It all seemed too far away. Mario was fighting for his life, fighting for the remnants of health and humanity that he still had left. He made it out of Sicily only to enter a deeper circle of hell in Normandy, where mankind's worst battle had just been waged. On June 10, 1944, Mario's company was 4 days behind the D-Day invasion of the Allied soldiers and following closely in their footsteps. As soon as we started to move inward, we saw bodies of paratroopers hanging from their chutes in the trees. Some were covered with them on the ground. Gliders were all over the place, smashed bodies clearly seen with no time to move them out. There were many German soldiers left behind. I had guard duty, and 2 men had their throats cut, killed the first night. I got my sleep wherever and whenever possible. I wanted to sleep under a tree, but it was no good. An airburst would get you. I thought about the woods. No, same problem. Even when all was quiet, it was almost impossible to rest. On June 15th, it got even worse. The shelling started at 7 a.m. Moments later, Mario's patrol found a platoon of their fellow soldiers fleeing from a gunfight. The leader, the next soldier, and all 13 men behind him had a bullet in or through them. They tell us we are in no man's land, in enemy territory, and there are snipers in the trees, as well as machine gun emplacements. Mario dove for cover as bullets began whizzing by. Unfortunately, his fate had already been settled, and there was no foxhole that might save him from it. I watched daisies swaying back and forth in the soft breeze. I remember birds chirping. And I started thinking about home, about football, going home. His patrol started moving again, but then artillery screamed overhead. 3 heavy 88mm shells.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?